The way banks originally approached this business was from the standpoint. Now, keep in mind that when leverage leasing started getting traction in the middle to late 70s, the length of the deals started out to be 12-year deals. Then they got to be 15, 18, and then 20, and sometimes beyond 20-year deals. And so what the bank was looking at is if you take a look at the original airline deals, and we were going from propellers to jets, and it was a 12-year deal, generally speaking, very low to zero residual risk in the transaction. And at the end of 12 years, the value of that airplane was at least as much as it was at the beginning. And so lessors were making a killing. They'd put the money out, and in those years, I think the depreciation was a little faster. So let's just leave it at 7 years for the moment. 7 years later, you got your entire equity investment back, and then you would get as much as 100% residual realization at the end of the lease term. Well, banks were in love with this sort of thing. And it was basically the brokerage community that kept telling the lessee, gosh, guys, you're leaving an awful lot of money on the table, and said, well, let's take the term out. Let's start in a competitive environment and get these guys to put a little more residual risk into it. And so gradually it continued to move up until it reached what was then a Reg Y cap of 25%. And increasingly, the competitive landscape became, how close to 25 are you willing to go in order to win this transaction? Okay. Of course, this is before the TBTs, and TBTs changed the landscape.
TBTs?
Yes, tax benefit transfer deals changed the landscape of leasing because it brought in a much broader avenue, a variety of lessors.
Is that what started the tax shelter type business and put it into high gear?
I don't know that it started the tax shelter business because there was an awful lot of business being done with doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. Okay. If you remember National Railway Utilization Corp., and otherwise known as NROC, there were a lot of railroad deals that were done just purely for tax shelter purposes. But from a bank standpoint, this tax benefit transfer business that was done just to swap tax benefits, not particularly for ownership of assets,
right,
brought in credit companies and industrial companies that heretofore had not really been in the business.
Right.
They looked at this, looked at the returns they were getting, and said, this isn't a bad way to shelter our tax bill. And so all of a sudden the likes of Beatrice, Philip Morris, trying to think of other industrials that came into the market. The market was literally flooded with new equity sources. Dart and Craft was another one. It just became very crowded very quickly.
Sure.
And so, go ahead.
Then I was going to ask you, the repeal of ITC in 1986, I think under Reagan, was that a kind of the beginning of the end of the tax shelter business, or the end of the tax shelter business, correct?
Yeah, I think that it set the tone. Let's put it that way. It set the tone for what the Hill was interested in doing economically. As the envelope continued to get pushed out in terms of more risk, longer term, things like that, Congress was looking for ways to limit and bracket the business. And the first real serious volley was the elimination of ITC, because although you were getting all of your equity back in whatever the depreciation period was for that time, in reality, the day you signed that lease, you were getting a combination of depreciation and ITC that would give you about 20+% of your money back that day.
Right.
So, I mean, banks just love this stuff.
Sure. Much like energy tax credits today, right?
Yeah. Yes. Same idea. And so, in this case, though, it sort of set the pole for Congress saying, you know what, guys, we understand you are all, pretty clever structuring people and so forth. But this, we're trying to bracket you guys and push you, back into a position where if you're going to get those kinds of returns, you really need to take more risk.
In an interview with Mike Fleming, he helped me go back a little bit, which will be coming up here in the future, in terms of what really stimulated the equipment leasing market that you and I know it today anyway. Back and I didn't get into the industry personally until around the 83 time frame. 81, 83 time frame, and at that point in time investment tax credit was around, but I had no recollection of when it was actually instituted and when the whole safe harbor tax shelter business of leasing started. Can you give us a little idea of your recollection when that all started to take place?
Well, actually, a lot of that took place way before I got in the business. If I'm not mistaken, I think FASB 13 goes back into the late 60s. And I don't think the business really got serious traction until, somebody figured out that they could reduce their borrowing rate significantly by doing a leverage lease. So if, in those days, your borrowing rate was you could probably reduce your borrowing cost, effective cost of borrowing, by 700 or 800 basis points as a lessee by leasing the equipment instead of going to the bank and borrowing to buy the equipment. And so a lot of lessees, not only because I happen to have been in the rail industry, but a lot of lessees in that business were shippers and needed the equipment. Because we had control of the equipment, we could force them, in effect, to accept the lease rather than the purchase.
Okay.
But then, of course, the airlines came along, and as we got, the 707 was really sort of the big airplane to move a lot of people and introduce you to the jet age. But it wasn't until the 727 was developed that the airline industry had now the tools to get into smaller airports. The 707 needs a 10,000-foot runway to stop itself because it doesn't have the technology that the new big airplanes have to stop. And so they couldn't get into Kansas City and other smaller towns.
Right.
It's the advent of the 727 that opened up all of America to the jet age.
And commercial leasing, equipment leasing on a commercial aircraft really took off at that point?
Yeah, and of course, once they deregulated the industry, then it was Katie bar the door, because it was like it was the equivalent of the Oklahoma land rush, where everybody was lined up, deregulation hit, and whoever could get out there and claim those city pairs and dominate those city pairs became the winner. And of course, if you're going to go out and do that, you need a lot of equipment. Okay. And so as we are in a position today, the airlines need new airplanes, and the leverage lease was soup du jour financially.